What is up, everybody? Welcome to the Week 14 Cash Game Review Show. As always, I am TJ Hernandez, your host, the director of DFS at 4for4.com, with my co-host, Matt Savoca. Before we get into our Cash Game Review today, just want to let you know about the easiest and most fun way to spice up the rest of your fantasy football season. It's Underdog Fantasy and their Pick'em game. Just pick the over or the under on your favorite or your least favorite player stats, and you can win up to 20 times your money in a single night. Underdog keeps it super simple with their easy-to-use website and mobile apps. Pick between 2 and 5 players, and you could take home some cold hard cash. Head over to 4for4.com/underdog. Claim your free 4for4 Pro subscription and get $10 in bonus cash to play this weekend on Underdog. Matt, how was your Week 14, sir?
Hey, it was all right. It was pretty good.
Looked good.
About 90th percentile,
Yeah.
thanks to the excellent projections over here at 4for4 and the value metric, leading me to about a 90th percentile finish. And
Beautiful.
so hit a couple of those 5X.
Yep.
And I think it was my best ROI day. I haven't put it all in the spreadsheet yet, but year to date, looking pretty darn good. One of the things, especially on FanDuel, is it was a fairly low-scoring week, and so there's only 13 non-quarterbacks, and that does include defenses, that score 20-plus fantasy points, and only George Kittle and Rashad Penny scored more than 25. So if you only had a couple of those 20-plus scorers, plus a QB that hit, you were having a good chance of getting there. And I had 2 of them, so pretty good week.
Yeah, that's. I mean, as always, you mentioned the you played the 5X's and the multipliers, and it's always something I don't want to brush over because as I've talked about in the past, I count those as part of my cash game return. And again, it doesn't matter how you calculate your return, as long as you're in the black. But that is very important to increasing your bottom line, especially with cash games getting tougher every week. So I mean, even if you haven't done it up to this point, we're 14 weeks in. We still have 4 weeks of regular season plus playoffs. You can still make up for some of those losses or for some of those missed weeks. If you put those lineups into some multipliers and you hit, it can make up for everything really quick. So make sure you're doing that. And yeah, it was a weird week. And we could throw Matt's lineup up there, but it was a weird week just in terms of like a mix of chalk hitting and not hitting. FanDuel was kind of a unique beast compared to DraftKings this week. So let's jump into some of your locks and hits on FanDuel this week.
Yeah, so I kind of had, once that value opened up with Jeff Wilson, even though it doesn't hit, I still locked in the build of Kamara, Eckler, and Jeff Wilson, and then moving around from there. And it was probably going to be Taysom Hill. I talked about on the DFS MVP show that I was kind of taking a stand with Alvin Kamara all week. We were kind of, I didn't say necessarily that we were overthinking things, but Taysom Hill hitting didn't necessarily mean that Alvin Kamara wasn't going to hit either. And I'm going to steal a stat from later in the show sheet, but New Orleans ended up running a play for Alvin Kamara, either a target or a rush, or a Taysom Hill rush on 70% of their opportunities. They had an 80% win probability by halftime. So they both get there with that crazy level of volume. And then Eckler, they said he could have returned to the game. If he plays a full game, he probably gets you 22 to 25 points. So I'm fine with that as a play. And then it was either, I have in the show sheet, Taysom or the GOATs. I was either getting up to Brady or Mahomes or maybe Russ Wilson. At a certain point, I just decided to lock in Taysom Hill and grab the value elsewhere. The wide receiver plan went pretty well. I was going for one of Godwin or DJ Moore, and definitely locking in Hunter Renfrow, player that I've talked up on the DFS MVP of late. And then it was either go up to Kittle or down for Hooper. And when I realized that the only other players near Jarvis Landry in the wide receiver value ranking for FanDuel were Jets, and I didn't want to game stack Kamara and Taysom and a third player from that game, it made it easy to just put 2 Browns players. Of course, it helps that they both score a touchdown. So ultimately, things kind of all work out. The Chargers defense is really the worst one here, but kind of, except for DJ Moore, really, hits across the board.
Yeah, It's interesting because usually the news of the free square is more important to DraftKings lineups than FanDuel lineups because FanDuel lineups are generally, we generally have more flexibility on FanDuel than on DraftKings with the salary. But with Jeff Wilson being available on FanDuel, some of the other values available to us late in the week weren't as important just because like some potentially high volume pass catchers in bad offenses aren't necessarily great plays on FanDuel. And usually a free square running back on FanDuel, we're still looking at like plus 5K range. Like a lot of times 5,500, that feels like a free square. Like we don't get a sub 5K player on FanDuel ever.
Right.
It was real. It's like, it was crazy even to see him priced that low, even though like we didn't know if Elijah Mitchell was playing. They just usually don't price players that have a chance at playing time that low. I really love the idea of. I think using it to get to a Kamara Eckler combo was a really sharp play. In the GPP pregame show on Sunday, like I mentioned that I didn't mind Taysom Hill and Alvin Kamara. We didn't have like data that supported that they had worked together before, but like my gut was like it's a really good play this week against the Jets, but I didn't lean into it. I kind of alligator armed it, and like obviously in retrospect, I wish I would have leaned into it harder. But I did like the play a lot of them together.
Yeah, and the last thing I will say is I noticed that if you went to the 4 for 4 generator, the lineup generator, and our value rankings, Antonio Gibson did shoot up the value
Yeah.
rankings, and I don't think he was a bad play, but I did kind of lock it in that I wasn't going to be affected by this Saturday night news related to Washington and Dallas's backfields. I just
Yeah.
decided to avoid it. Ezekiel Elliott didn't look good. So even though the volume projection looked good with Pollard possibly being out, I just decided it wasn't necessary with the type of build I was doing. And the same thing with Gibson. I was taking two stud running backs and the value, a very unique value under 5K in Wilson.
Yeah, I don't think. I mean, people definitely use Zeke and Cash. I don't think he was ever in play just because of what we've seen from him and that offense, and he still ended up getting spelled quite a bit, even with Pollard not in there. And we actually mentioned on the podcast that we think that might happen. We didn't know how, but he didn't end up getting like all of the running back work. And we should mention with Eckler, even though he gets injured and still 15 points is decent. I mean, leading up to Saturday. I don't know how it played out like Sunday morning because I didn't look at FanDuel scores when I was building Sunday morning. But I mean, he was lapping the field on both sides in terms of value and projection at the position. So he was kind of the player that we were talking about building around leading up to the week. So the Eckler play was pretty, especially with Keenan Allen out. Like obviously we don't just say all Keenan Allen short targets go to Eckler, but the idea that he could see an increased role was definitely there. So I mean the hits are fantastic this week on FanDuel. Obviously, we still do end up with a few decision points. Always do on FanDuel because we could fit so many smash plays into these lineups. So, what were some things you were toying with leading up to lock?
Yeah, a lot of Sunday morning was how do I fit Kittle into here?
Yeah,
And I ultimately felt like I was going to have to change the build structure. And I actually, like, I wrote it here in our notes, I wrote AP, which we got to find, we call these decision points, right? And
yeah,
we kind of relate them to misses sometimes on this show. But we also have anchor points. And
yep.
for me, those anchor points were Taysom Hill, Alvin Kamara, and Austin Eckler. And from that, I was building around that. That was my anchor point. I don't know if that's going to stick. That's what I just thought of. But,
Yeah,
the only other players I kind of had were Leonard Fournette, FOMO a little bit. The value ranking was high all week. The ownership was coalescing around him. So it just looked like a very strong play. He gets there almost immediately against the Bills. And then the last thing I will say is that the difference between DJ Moore and Jamar Chase was about 400, or exactly 400. And with San Francisco ruling out multiple players in the secondary on Saturday night, it kind of looked like the sky was opening up for Jamar Chase. And I think I should have leaned into that, figured out a way to get up to him. Maybe it changes my defense, which I think I over prioritized that defense. The value ranking didn't tell me, my biases did. So if I had gone to Chase, this lineup is absolutely smashing. So other than that, pretty good.
Yeah, usually I'm pretty on point with like those the late news plus like well Wilson actually didn't end up being as chalky as I thought he would be on either site, but
That's true.
like yeah, so that was kind of surprising. It might have had to do with just values opening up elsewhere and Debo being active, which I didn't think people would react as strongly to, but if going into the weekend, like me thinking that Jeff Wilson was going to be such a strong or popular play, like leaning into the other side of the passing game was kind of an obvious play in retrospect that I just whiffed on. So I'm kind of upset at myself about that. But I mean, still overall, just a fantastic lineup. I mean, and again, one thing we didn't talk about on Friday or with this lineup yet is late swap, and really so many of our value plays were late in the game. Obviously, you get Taysom and Kamara get there early, so you're not stressing too much about it. But I mean, did you even have any concerns or interest in late swap or any thoughts about like so many players going in the late window? Not even necessarily just from your lineup, but that were like the popular plays of the week.
Yeah, honestly, it was 3 to 3:30. I've learned that 3 to 3:30 Eastern is a time where I want to late swap, but I don't have enough information yet. And sure enough, a great reminder of that was Taysom Hill's huge touchdown run. And ultimately, once that run happened, I just sat. This was my lineup at 11 a.m. on Sunday. And, I typically am late swapping, and I think I had to do it for one game, and I, ended up taking, losing that head to head. But ultimately, I just stayed here for most of the lineups.
Yeah, and actually, now that you say that Taysom Hill late run, now that I remember, actually in some tournament lineups, I did swap to the Bengals, but I swapped to their rushing games, so that was how my tournament week went. But yeah, I mean, it was actually just a really unique week in terms of so many of our values being on the late slate, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. I mean, your lineup finishes in the 90th percentile, and I think your build was pretty much like the ideal build. But did you see anything else in like very strategically based builds, not the outliers, that stood out as really sharp lineup builds that you didn't have?
Yeah, getting to the key players in that Tampa Bay Buffalo game definitely worked, particularly if you prioritize the quarterbacks and the key players on the Buccaneers. Everyone except Gronk really gets there. People were leaning into Taysom and Kamara more than I thought. And of course, Hunter Renfrow, especially on FanDuel, was a really good value. So people got there a lot. I was surprised that of the people who got there in the Seattle versus Houston game, Rashad Penny was one of them, but there was some correlation plays with Rashad Penny and Tyler Lockett. So, that's obviously the passing game was in a good spot there against Houston. I thought Penny was a little bit too contrarian for a cash game, but I completely get it.
Yeah, I don't think I'm ever getting to Penny and cash, and I mean Payne, like obviously Hooper gets there with the touchdown. I thought all week that trying to pay up for a tight end was pretty sharp. Obviously nobody's playing Andrews in that spot in cash, but we had a lot of tight ends in very good spots. Obviously Kittle's one you want in cash games, but again, I mean, we're never going to be able to get all of the smash spots in a cash game build, so I really like it overall. Any last thoughts on FanDuel for the week?
Yeah, and just to add to that thought, if I go to Kittle, if you follow the value rankings, I'm probably getting down to those Jets receivers, and those Jets receivers really struggled, so that really changes the whole build. So ultimately, that may have saved me. I was going to save this for later, but I do think that, I really thought about this Dallas and Washington game, and we knew about Pollard, and we kind of had a thought about McKissick as well. And so I made that decision on Saturday night, freeing up my mind for other tough decisions, and that really helped. So I'm going to try to keep narrowing stuff down on Saturday night instead of Sunday morning.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. Other than like any late breaking news, of course, but like having that just that core and really try not to make a ton, like all of your decision points on the fly, I think helps a lot. And even just like I did this week, maybe like coming off of our theory discussion about dealing with losing streaks and just really dealing with like the mental part, is like I did some like really light building on Saturday and then just made it a point just to like just to really sleep on it and not be making all of my, making every hand build on Saturday night, but just narrowing my player pool and then building Sunday morning. And it was kind of it just flowed a lot better. I think setting every single tournament lineup on Saturday, and then you wake up kind of with this mix of like, you have this bias of like being anchored to this team that you built, but then also not wanting to switch to news. I think at least having this very narrow player pool going to bed on Saturday is pretty good.
Yeah, I think that's really smart. And obviously, building at different times of the week is probably plus EV, right? Because you're in different headspaces at different times. So it's not a bad idea to build early. But when you get stuck at those decision points and you just keep leaning on what you already decided, that's when we can run into trouble. So I get that.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move on over to DraftKings. Like you had a very good day, not quite 90th percentile, but 76th percentile. Was making a run at, like, I always put my stuff in like a winner take all or super small 100-man or something. Was making a run at it for a little bit. Didn't quite get there once Eckler got hurt and Jeff Wilson gives me nothing, but still a 76th percentile lineup. On DraftKings, it was one of my favorite weeks. Unlike like week 13, we had a lot of very strong plays, and I think that's what people think is a good cash game week. I actually think those are very tough weeks for cash games. As we discussed last week, when it becomes like just a jam all your studs, you kind of dial back your volume a little bit. In a week like this, I thought the cash game pool was very small. I thought it was some very obvious builds and very obvious values, especially late in the week. I didn't think they were necessarily good cash game plays, just because it was a lot of players like you see in my lineup, like a Jeff Wilson, like a Austin Hooper, that you didn't love. But in weeks like that, I really want to just like lean into the obvious builds. Early on in the week, I just thought it was so obvious. I wrote up Taysom Hill and Cam Newton, but really it was only Taysom Hill as a cash game play. Price below $6,000, like we know what he's capable of on the ground. The week before, he throws 4 interceptions and was still the QB4 on the week. Once we get word that Mike Williams is playing and Keenan Allen isn't, he's just a tremendous value. Down at $6,000. We had already talked about Eckler being the insanely good value. And then once I find out, again, that Mike Williams is playing, Jared Cook was an early week value for me at tight end. But I really just didn't want to play 3 Chargers because I did think Jalen Guyton and Josh Palmer would be involved. I didn't think it would be to the extent that they were. But I didn't want to like take the risk of having Cook and Williams in there and Guyton and Palmer like stealing all the touchdowns or something, like very bad luck like that. Cook actually scored, I believe, but still I just didn't want to play all of them. So for me, Taysom, Mike Williams, Eckler, Hooper were kind of my locks, and then it was just a matter of how I was going to shuffle the rest. Again, my player pool was very small, but just deciding how I was going to shuffle the rest of them.
Yeah, and you know what? We talked about how the locks for that Los Angeles offense were so obviously going to be Mike Williams and Austin Eckler. And we even said that they might combine for a 50% target share. And they were at a 36% target share. And Eckler didn't even play 50% of snaps based on that injury and the way they use him a little bit. But like it was headed that way. So, Cook gets there, but that's just the variance of football. So the only thing that really surprises me is maybe it's a little bit of variance of the lineup you're showing, but 17% ownership for Jeff Wilson. I kind of felt like, all right, well, if he only gets me 6 points, at least the whole field was getting there. At least in this specific contest that you pulled this lineup from, that's not the case.
Yeah, so that was actually my point going into my big decision point was just like, where am I going to save salary? Because we had 2 players that popped up late in the week in Jeff Wilson and Jamison Crowder. Once we found out Elijah Moore was put on IR, they're both similarly priced. Crowder was at 47, I believe, and Wilson at 44. And it was such an interesting week because we had the cheap tight ends. We had Mike Williams at 6K. We had Taysom Hill that. I was never really going to play Wilson and Crowder together because we already had so much salary savings that it was almost like I was too low on salary that I was going to be forcing in studs that I didn't even necessarily want in my lineup. So even though they both were good values in my opinion. It was one or the other, and obviously Debo comes back and ends up. He hurts Wilson's projection a little bit, but Wilson was still popping as a value, and then the problem was, like, if I was going to play Crowder instead of Wilson, I probably just get up to Josh Jacobs. But I was really worried about the Raiders. This was like how I ended up here. I was really worried about the Raiders game script, even though Josh Jacobs was getting a lot of targets or saw 9 targets in the previous game. I wanted to prioritize Renfrow once I found out that Waller was going to be out again, and I didn't want to play 2 Raiders in my lineup. Again, the surprise was I just didn't think the disparity between Wilson and Crowder would be so big in terms of ownership. I thought it was going to be more of a coin flip because I did think we had a very obvious type build. Wilson ends up being 17% owned. Crowder ends up being 47% owned or something like that. So if I have that information in front of me, it's kind of more obvious. And then just once that build happens, I know I still wanted some Tampa Bay or Buffalo player. Like, there wasn't an obvious Buffalo player because Stephon Diggs was so expensive. It was just kind of like who fits in here. And I liked Mike Evans more just as an overall play because he was so much cheaper. But then Godwin just kind of fits in, and we know he's going to be the volume guy at the very least. He obviously gets our 10 catches and 100 yards, a great game. But I just wanted a player from that game.
Yeah, you got to get to one of those 4, and I had a bunch of Gronk lineups that I was building early on Sunday morning and on Saturday night. He was a fine play. Of course, he doesn't get there. Fournette was really highly owned, more highly owned than I even expected. I guess the last question I have for you is, did you consider Ezekiel Elliott at all? Because I know his ownership really skyrocketed on Sunday morning.
No, I was never planning on playing Zeke. I mean, Gibson wasn't necessarily a lock to me, but again, with how small my player pool was, and just the way him and Jacobs were very interchangeable, both in terms of value and salary, and none of my builds really had them together. Again, I kind of had the lock button on Eckler. That if I did end up with like a Crowder or something, it was either just suck it up and play Jacobs or try to figure out a way to get up to Fournette. And in retrospect, like when I'm thinking about how small my running back player pool was, if we include Jacobs and Fournette, and I don't even think I had another running back in my player pool. I might have written someone else. Oh, I wrote up Javonte, but then I was pretty much off of him once I found out Melvin was playing.
You couldn't play. I couldn't believe how many people did play him, and of course he
gets there, but it felt pretty bad because we had no evidence that Javonte was going to be a 65% touchback with Gordon healthy. I mean, Detroit's awful and their run defense is horrible, but them combining for 4 touchdowns is just like that's a top 1% outcome. So I was off Javonte. I guess I still didn't hate it because he was sub 6K. But my point is, if I would have just kind of looked at it from a value standpoint, probably I should have on a slate where I said I thought it was the player pool was small, but the players were weak. Probably just should have prioritized a better running back situation than Wilson, namely Fournette, and then that gets me to Crowder. The problem is, I don't know if I come off of Godwin or Renfrow. So if I go to a Crowder Fournette build somehow instead of a Renfrow Wilson, I'm really just 2v2 with kind of the same scores. So I think the point is, by having my very tight player pool, like you had mentioned, narrowing that down on Saturday, by really narrowing it down, I'm still moving things around and not 100% confident in that 2v2, but I still get there, right? And I have a player pool that I'm confident in the values, and it ends up working out. So I think the bigger takeaway is that we continue to really have these weeks on DraftKings where if you're understanding what the build is, where the value is coming from, and really leaning into that, more times than not you're going to be profitable and let other people make mistakes. And I know it seems like a lot of people might not be because there's so many like same lineups. But listen, I rolled out what I thought was just the most obvious build, and it comes in the the top 75% or the top 25% of lineups. So I mean, until that stops happening, I'm gonna keep doing it.
Yeah. I was actually surprised. I felt my lineup, maybe because of the positive correlation with Jarvis Landry and Austin Hooper, that it would be duped. But even in the biggest tournament the biggest cash game, I put it in over 20,000 lineups. It was a unique lineup. Did you experience the same thing?
No. So I mean, on FanDuel again, we're gonna have so many different options. You could play so many different
Yeah,
studs
that's
that we're
part
just
of it.
gonna see. Yeah, less dupe lineup. My lineup was duped 35 times. But again, I mean, 35 other people out of this is the in the $100, the biggest double up with 1,111 people. There were like clumps of dupe lineups in like the 152 to 137 point range, which was basically a combination of my player pool. And again, I think it can be discouraging for people to like see that and be like, oh, well, everybody's just doing the same thing. There's no edge. Well, I just look at it differently. Like 35% of the field doesn't play Taysom Hill, which that's still 65% ownership or 76% in this tournament. Sorry, I was looking at a different one, but 25% of the field doesn't play Taysom Hill, which it's still a huge ownership for a quarterback, but in a week where it just seems so obvious, all of those like Josh Allen, Dak Prescott, Tom Brady lineups, they're really playing catch up. And like, it was a week where paying up for quarterback in cash games on DraftKings felt egregious. Obviously, Josh Allen lineups get there, but he has to have a double bonus, like 99.9% game for those. Even the sharp Josh Allen lineup builds like barely get there because you're paying up so much for quarterback. I mean, really, the only thing that the people that were able to get to Renfro and Leonard Fournette combinations, those were the ones that were like still the sharp builds and ended up smashing more than this. But I don't know. I just am. I love being able to go into these weeks where I can just let people make mistakes, and people think that there aren't enough people making mistakes. But I mean, I'm very comfortably in the black on the season with this approach, throwing them into contests where you can multiply your money by more than just your double up or your head-to-head wins, and I think it continues to be profitable. And there's enough people making mistakes, until maybe we'll get to the point where they aren't, but for now there are.
Yeah, it's like that annoying kind of ping pong player who can just hit every kind of ball back,
Yeah.
just waiting for you to screw up on the other side.
Yeah.
No, I mean, and we're kind of dancing around the point here, which is that at that salary, Taysom Hill getting to that score was a have to have it score. Pretty much
Right.
have to have it score. You got to be perfect. You can do it because there were high scores from Brady and Allen, in more obvious spots. But if you had a combination of Hill and Renfro, or Hill and Fournette, or Hill, Kamara, Renfro, just some combos of that, you could make mistakes in other places, like Jeff Wilson.
Yeah. And that's really the point. Like, there were some Josh Allen lineups that did very well. Josh Allen was the second most popular quarterback on the slate at 10% in this double up field. But you needed Josh Allen to hit perfect again. Like, there was a couple lineups that had basically the correct player pool. Like, all of the players in my player pool. I know I'm going out on a limb saying my player pool is the correct player pool, but what I thought was the correct player pool, Josh Allen, if he scores 30 instead of 42 or 46 or whatever, you're not cashing. And that's still a very good day, but like, that's how different it is if you're not going with the obvious values. You're putting yourself into a corner where you have to hit perfectly, even if the rest of your player pool is really sharp. So I'm pretty happy with the week and the way it played out.
Yeah, really nice run.
In terms of overall, just overview of the week. Whether it be NFL, DFS, general fantasy, is there anything that stood out to you from week 14?
Yeah, we talked about the Saints just basically leaning on their two players, Taysom and Kamara, plenty. The big thing that surprised me was the KC offense going completely ham, but none of their big players really having monster performances. You didn't really need any of them. That's really surprising. The multiple running backs scoring obviously is, that's going to happen sometimes. Yeah. But the other thing that annoyed me so much is that in that Carolina-Atlanta game, there's so much scoring, but Robbie Anderson finally shows up. I think he was in the Sunday Millionaire winning lineup on FanDuel at under 2% ownership. And obviously, I should have realized that it is a cash game show, but with DJ Moore at such a high value, that kind of meant that the game environment was good enough that Robbie Anderson could hit. That's a more tournament-focused thought, but it was still surprising as well. That's pretty much... We talked about a lot of other things here, but that's pretty much it.
Yeah, the KC thing, I think people are going to look at the stats, look at Kelsey's usage, look at Tyreek's day. I'm not out on this offense by any means. I mean, we always know touchdown variance can go, can go a couple different ways, and people are like, well, Kelsey's not even getting the volume. I mean, when your defense scores a touchdown on the first play of the game, that game is just like really going to go awry. And then I think the second touchdown was the swing pass that went for like 40 yards. So I mean, when you're just rolling that quickly, it really just takes you out of the need to get to Tyreek and Kelsey a lot. I just think the point with the Chiefs is they put up that many points. I know both of their big games in the last 6 weeks or whatever have been against the Raiders, but their defense is going to continue to put you in good spots. And
that defense has really improved.
Yeah, and it just feels like Mahomes is fine. And I think we're going to have some... I think we're going to have some really big opportunities. I don't know how many main slates Casey has left, but I feel like we're going to have some really big opportunities after they're on Thursday this week, closing out the year to lean into them if we get them on some main slates.
Yeah, completely agree. And hope to see Russell Wilson and hopefully DK Metcalf, but also Tyler Lockett connecting on deep balls, just better for fantasy when that offense is clicking.
Yeah, definitely. You talked about your Saturday nights a little bit, and again, our approaches are pretty dialed at this point. But any big approach overviews that you're going to take into these last few weeks of the season?
That's about it. Just also reminding myself that, there's a little bit of variance and luck that goes into a 90th percentile outcome, but also it's the result of solid process. So just taking a moment, pat myself on the back, moving on to the next week, and trying to keep up that same solid process going forward.
Yeah, I'm going to keep encouraging myself and everybody to play as many slates as possible. Especially like this week, we just had most of the chalk was in the late window, or at least the high scoring games and GPP plays were in the late window, which really gave you a great opportunity to play the early only slate and not feel like you're hedging, just have some really unique lineups compared to a lot of your tournament lineups. And we have a lot of really big slates coming up. Bye weeks are over, and we're getting some Saturday games, but we're going to have a lot of these really big main slates and I think a couple of them are kind of split down the middle, so it's going to give us an opportunity to where if there's a couple where there's like 6 early, 6 late, like you're going to be able to play like basically 3 main slates at once if you want to play early only, late only, and the full main slate. So you're going to be able to build a lot differently, and where you might miss on one slate or the other can really make up for it, again, without doing a forced hedge type deal. So down the stretch, I'm really looking to play more slates, especially on the Sunday only games.
Yeah, let's lock in. Season's far from done. Lots more content.
Yeah, we're still going through Super Bowl. So if you do plan on playing for the rest of the season through Super Bowl and you haven't signed up for 4 for 4 yet, our rest of season price has dropped down to $24, so make sure you get signed up for that. If you sign up with the promo code DFSMVP, you will get an additional 10% off. Please like and follow us here on YouTube as you're watching our cash game review, and make sure you're checking out all of our other shows. Every Friday, the DFS MVP, our regular value show, is at 3 p.m. Pacific time, 6 p.m. Eastern time here on YouTube, and the audio comes out on our podcast channel. Every Saturday, Yahoo DFS Values with Matt Harmon of Yahoo Fantasy comes out on the DFS MVP and the Yahoo Podcast Fantasy feeds. And then every Sunday morning, the GPP Last Look show. That is with Jordan Vanek. It's subscriber-only Discord, 8 a.m. Pacific time, 11 a.m. Eastern time. Make sure you get signed up in the description below for that Discord channel. And make sure you follow us on Twitter. 4 for 4 is at 4 for 4 Football. Matt is at Draftaholic. I'm at TJ Hernandez. We'll talk to you guys on Friday.